Hi to everybody who's seeing us. I'm extremely excited today to be talking to Karma Kotman from Ujima. We will be trying to make a call of action about ending violence against women in the Black community. Karma, how are you doing today?
I am doing well. I'm so happy to be here with you, Pamela, today.
And as I said before, we really want to kind of keep this as a conversation between, I so admire the work Ujima does and its involvement with the Black community, and we want to be open, talk about problems, and especially how can we kind of move forward with solving some of those. But to everybody who's listening, who might have not have the pleasure to see Karma before, let me tell you that she has worked in the gender-based violence field for over 20 years. She has worked internationally and nationally in the United States at the local and national level to ensure that policies and legislations are responsive to the needs of gender-based violence survivors, particularly from communities of color. Through Ujima, Karma has established federal funding streams and national TA centers focused on increasing access for culturally specific services, provides to federal and state funding support. Most importantly, in her downtime, she enjoys spending time with family and friends. And I love that, Karma. I love that's part of, the way that you're describing yourself. And I think many more of us that work in this sector who, we've had fantastic discussions about women of color and the way that we work and how we've, sometimes just leave hours in it. But and that you actually describe your time with your friends and family is so important. But because of that, tell us a little bit about you as a woman and how you were driven to this work.
So let me first say congratulations, Pamela, and the No More team. This has been an amazing week of activities celebrating your anniversary. You all have given so much to the field, so much to the work around ending and responding to gender-based violence. And so just congratulations to you all for closing out what has been an incredible year.
Thank you so much.
Yes. So I really do describe myself as central to my work is my family and friends in grounding me in this space. I, as you mentioned, have been in the field for over 20 years, working at the local level, working in state domestic violence coalitions in Washington, D.C. and in Florida, always with a focus on Black women and girls and on Black community, how we lift up the experiences of our community as central to this work, and as really a beacon and a guiding light for me in terms of the philosophy, the driving force, how we frame the issues, thinking about policy and practice, and how policy and practice respond to women and girls, and specifically to women and girls of color. Really important for me, Pamela, is lifting up our lived realities, the intersections that guide us, the ways that we live. When we talk about domestic violence, when we talk about sexual assault, when we talk about gender-based violence, for many of us, all of the other experiences of our life, right, also impact the ways that we seek help, the ways that we heal. And so those things are central to my experiences with gender-based violence and how we advocate on behalf of survivors, but also guiding the work of Ujima.
What drove you, Karma? What was it that told you this is the way?
I feel like part of it is that my name is Karma, and so my parents have always been like, to someone who has been raised in love and experienced love, that much has to be given back, right, and given back to our community. And so I've always been in touch with the journey of women, the journey of Black women and girls, and really our experiences in this country. That has been a guiding factor. I've been influenced by so many incredible women in the work, Umi Hankins, Antonia Van, people who have really laid the way in this work, Beth Ritchie, and then those wonderful women that work beside me. You all have met Serena. I could not do any of this work without Greta Gardner and Jennifer Hooker and so many other folks that are working with us, women, incredible women who are working with us in this field, too many to name, but they really do drive me. And as of late, I have a 4-year-old niece and an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old actually nephew. And so the reality of leaving this place better, and I know that sounds like, kind of kitschy, but it is very serious when we think about the next generation of women and girls having access right now, as we think about the policies that have been most recently enacted in the US, to somewhat less freedom than what we have had, and wanting to influence policy in a way that their lives are enriched.
And Carva, I think it's an interesting thing. You mentioned kind of love and being raised in an environment like that. And many so often stories we hear, stories of survivors that have been pushed to this. But in many occasions, we don't talk about that often. You have stories where actually, things like that didn't happen, and actually that moved us to give this kind of next step, right? So that is amazing to hear. And let's talk a little bit, and sorry, another thing to mention was your thoughts about the women that you have around you. That happens to me. I have the strongest team of women around me. My co-workers, my chair of No More, they're awesome. Like, I wouldn't be able to do this. I'm about to cry, I think, if they weren't around me.
Yeah.
And I know how so much their inspiration, their love, their, has gone in their life in many occasions, keeps on driving what I do. So, it's awesome to give recognition to all the people that work around us for this. Can you tell me a little bit about Ujima and some of the work that you guys do and some of the programs for anybody who might not be familiar?
Absolutely. So Ujima is a national resource center. We are focused on addressing domestic violence, sexual assault, and community violence in the Black community. We define our community as broad as possible. So when we talk about the Black community, we are talking and center the experiences of African American, Afro-Latinx, African Caribbean, African immigrants in this country. And so really lifting up their realities. Our work is through research and evaluation. So Ujima has a research and evaluation work group that helps to develop what we call Black papers, identify gaps in research as they relate to these issues, and help to drive our policy. We do training and technical assistance. So we provide training and technical assistance to culturally specific organizations. Those are organizations that are developed by and for our community. We also work with state domestic violence coalitions. We do training and technical assistance for states, for territories, for units of government. We also have a new grant program that was just launched and funded by the American Rescue Plan, where we were able to provide just about $5.5 million to local organizations addressing domestic violence in our community, in the Black community. And then through our partnership with the National Organization of Sisters of Color Ending Sexual Assault, able to provide another $5 million to organizations addressing sexual assault in the Black community. So that idea, Pamela, of leading with community, leading with the experiences of our voices shows up in our policy work and our research and evaluation and our training and technical assistance, and in the funding programs that we've provided. In addition to that, we have a legal team that works with the Office on Violence Against Women. We have a program that works with historically Black colleges and universities. And we partner with the same organization, CSAE, on a national resource center that focuses on community violence, on violence in all of its forms, and increasing the capacity of culturally specific organizations to access funding and resources.
I'm so grateful to your work, because many small organizations of color struggle to get funding, especially from traditional philanthropies or, major donors, right? The frontline work that they do is incredible, but it's hard for them to fund. So it's amazing that you're able to get those kind of initiatives. And something that I think it's very important for everybody to know, and I'm sure you can explain this to them, is why is it important to have specialist support services that are for minority communities? Why can't it just be mainstream, for example?
Well, one of the things that we saw, and I point a lot to historically, what we know is that our communities engage with systems differently because of oppression, because of bias, because of racism and how they show up in our lives. The ways that we access services are different. So, for instance, the focus on the criminal justice and criminal legal system doesn't show up the same in our communities. Some of those systems that we frame as helpful can actually be harmful for our communities. And so the establishment of and support of culturally specific organizations that have the duality of understanding the issues of domestic violence, of sexual assault, but also understand the lived experience, the context in which we experience violence and the context in which we heal, the way that we heal, the organizations that we or entities that we seek for help is critical to ensuring that all survivors have access to the resources that we need. So that idea of being by and for, led by, steeped in, and really understanding the realities of our communities is central to ensuring that these survivors have access to the resources that they need.
I think it's very important to talk about trust, right? There is trust from survivors when, they can go to people who will understand them, who have the same background, have gone through the same thing. In Europe, there's quite a stat about 50% of referrals for people of color actually are word of mouth. So if you don't work with a community and systems, then it's also really hard to engage people to trust the system.
Absolutely. To trust the system, to think about how we tell our stories. The way that we tell our stories is very unique to us. Like, we can see someone from across the room and there are ways that we communicate that are nonverbal that we just understand, right? As communities of color and having certain lived experience. And that shows up in the ways that we seek services. And Pamela, you're so right with trust. I mean, trust is so important when you think about survivors that have not been able to navigate on their own, that have been controlled, that are living in fear. When they are seeking services, trust is paramount. And so when they come to a program where the people look like them, understand their language, are able to talk with them from a place of mutual understanding and mutual respect, that's critical.
And it can make such a difference. And it's also important, this idea of we were talking throughout the week about getting women of color through leadership and being examples for generations also to come, who are coming to support the work, to get them involved, because we need to keep on developing that trust, with anybody who needs it. So really important. Let's talk a little bit, Karma, about, of course, gender-based violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, it happens in every community. The numbers for the general population are absolutely staggering. 1 in 3, in some places 1 in 4 women will be affected. But can you talk to us why the dynamic for a Black woman is different? Let's try to talk a little bit about, we just frame it for anybody seeing us. What is the prevalence? Why is there a difference?
Sure. So we know that Black women experience domestic violence at higher rates, but also, Pamela, that lethality, the issues around Black women being harmed and murdered by an intimate partner are much higher. And so Black women are actually 3 times more likely to be murdered by an intimate partner than their white counterparts. And that for us, when you think about trust, like you talked about earlier, when we talk about the need for culturally specific services, understanding that real danger for Black women, understanding why that shows up for community, and understanding how that shows up for community is very important. One of the things that we like to do is to talk about the statistics, absolutely, to lift up the fact that we are overrepresented in almost every system. And so that really does impact the ways that we seek services. That when you think about harm, that we are harmed more. When we think about lethality, that we are more likely to be murdered. But to frame that in the why. Because people can walk away from that and think, well, their communities are just more violent. And so that's why this is happening. And that is not true. We want to be able to couple, here are the statistics. We certainly are experiencing violence at these disparate rates, but also why we talk about root causes at Ujima is because access to handguns is more prevalent in our communities, because when we think about how racism and oppression and bias show up in our communities, then you understand what the role that systems play in the lives of Black women and girls. And so it's really important when we talk at Ujima that we couple those statistics with the why, with root causes, so that people don't walk away with thinking, oh, well, the Black community is just more dangerous, or the Black community just commits more harm, or Black women and girls who are traditionally not seen as victims anyway, because of the way that racism and oppression have worked. We want to be able to talk about, there are these statistics and there are root causes to why we are more vulnerable to experiencing violence overall.
And let's kind of get a little bit deeper on that, because there are a lot of challenges there that will come with, obviously the lethality rates. Let's talk a little bit about some of those challenges that you commonly see that Black women are facing, really, in terms of maybe not only being affected by gender-based violence, but maybe making a decision of leaving a relationship, for example.
Right. So when we think about systems, right, traditionally, when we talk about how a survivor seeks assistance, we think someone is supposed to call law enforcement, and then law enforcement helps to keep them safe. Then they go into a shelter. That shelter keeps them safe. They can engage with people who help intervene with their children. But for Black women, when you think about that same course of response, when we think about calling law enforcement, because we are overrepresented in each one of those systems, because when we think about the intervention with children in our systems, we think about how children of color are overrepresented in the child welfare system. And so that means then that Black women are not seeking those same systems of support, right? And that for our communities, they can actually be harmful. We also think about the fact that Black men are overrepresented in almost all of those systems as well. And so when Black women think about what are our options and what are our choices, we're also thinking, how do we keep our entire community safe? If we are overrepresented, over-policed, more harmed by these systems, then we have a tendency, what some people will say, we're supposed to be the keepers and caretakers of our community. And so sometimes we put that safety, our community safety, before our individual safety, right? And so we're not likely to call law enforcement because we don't want to have another Black man entered into a system that can be harmful. Or we're not likely to call law enforcement because when we do call, we are not seen as victims. And so that can be equally harmful. We're not likely to talk about what is happening to our children because we're more likely to have our children taken away from us. We're not likely to enter shelter because the people working in shelter don't look like us, don't understand our individual and our cultural context. And many times, Pamela, what we've seen is that stop short of, a shelter will say, oh, well, we're adept at and can provide services to this community because we have the right hair care products, or, because we've figured out how to have access to the kind of food you eat. But it goes deeper than that, right? And so that's one of the things that we talk about a lot, is that you can't divorce the intersections, right? You can't divorce our lived realities, how systems show up in our lives, with the ways that we seek help. And when we provide training and when we provide technical assistance, when we look at funding, all of those things are not just a part of, they are central to the way that we do work.
I want to kind of reflect a little bit, and we're going to go back to this issue of trust and law enforcement, and try to make everybody who's seeing us really understand the problem here for women who are trying to flee violence. If you do not trust that a police officer will help you, if you believe that somebody that you care about, who might be perpetrating violence to you, but you still care about him because you went into a relationship with them and you want to leave them, but you don't want them in prison necessarily, or you fear he'll be in prison and never come out, then you are just have barriers and barriers in front of you. And so it makes it much more difficult for anybody to make that step. And I think, Karma, as we're talking about some of these challenges, I think it's important to talk a little bit about, we're talking about when the Black community, we talk also, in other occasions, the term women of color, but also within groups, there are different approaches and different ways that the police might treat you depending where you're from. I don't know if you want to reflect a little bit that it's not only one group that this happens to, but there's like micro divisions, let's put it this way.
Oh, absolutely. And this idea, Pamela, it's so important that you lift this up, because I think one of the things that people misunderstand is the idea that when we're talking about the perceptions with law enforcement, or perceptions with court, or perceptions with child welfare, it's as if we think those things are happening, and it's not. These are actual reality, right? It is an actual reality that we are overrepresented in these systems. And so when we're talking to women and girls of color, is leading with the fact that this is not only your perception, this is truth. Right. And that is critical. It's important, because that is a framework that for women and girls of color, building that trust has got to be that you respect my truth. And so that's paramount. But when we think about even within our communities, is why as Ujima, we talk about when we define our community, we define our community in the broadest way. When we understand, when we're providing training and technical assistance, there are specific challenges for Black immigrant women. There are specific challenges for Black women who don't speak English, for whom English is not their first language when we're talking in the US context. When we're talking about women with mental health disability and other disabilities, when we're talking about Black LGBTQ communities, that there are, of course, very specific challenges for those communities. Certainly race and ethnicity are in of themselves can be barriers when you're thinking about accessing systems, when you're thinking about accessing services. But germane to our community, there are various different communities within our community. Black women living in rural communities that aren't in metropolitan cities, right? There is a diversity and a range of experiences within our communities. And I'm so grateful to you for bringing that up, Pamela, because it's one of the things that we talk about very often. We aren't monolithic. People approach our community as if we've all had the same experience, as if we all speak the same language, as if we all live in major cities. And so really lifting up that we have our own experiences within the community, that we have a diversity of experiences and a diversity of histories within our community is really important.
I think you brought something which I like to believe as unfortunately a terrible postcode lottery. You brought rural, for example, against urban, or we're talking about the importance of minority organizations that tend to be most likely in areas where there are kind of large groups, right, of Black women, etc. But if you are a Black person in a state where that's not the minority community, or there's historical racism as against this group, your experience will be much more different than if you're living in an urban locality where there is several services for Black women. So I think that's that we lose that from times.
Yes, we do. We do. We don't, and I think that this is the experience for a lot of women of color, but particularly for us in the Black community, because there is a perception that for the most part, we have assimilated into the larger context and the larger culture, and not understanding that we have our own culture, we have our own language, we have our own histories and experiences. And so even when we think about Black survivors living in rural communities, we've been there. We have been in rural communities, but we don't show up in the same numbers.
Yeah.
And yes, the same thing is true when we're in rural communities. Very often, because we don't show up in those same numbers, we're already isolated in some ways. And so when you think about someone who is also experiencing violence layered on to that isolation, the access to services, assistance, help is very, very, very critical, right? There are certain barriers there, but then having access to culturally specific services, even more challenging.
I think you also brought up an incredible point. It kind of one of these myth bunkers, or maybe it's that we don't think about it in a rounded way, which was Black migrant women. Right? I
Right.
think we think about, a group, I'm Hispanic, so you kind of think about, a Latino population migrating into the US. You don't kind of think about all the other pockets also of migrants, including Black women who might come with the same problems, right? Lack of language, coming from places where, for example, police was not an option, and maybe it's not here in the US either, or they might get to feel that. So those are all added challenges that the Black community has to deal when it comes to gender-based violence.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We work a lot with Black Latinx communities. We work a lot with individuals coming from different African nations who have to learn the culture first, and then also have to deal with, yes, understanding what the differences in our systems, understanding and navigating community. And so those survivors absolutely face different barriers in some ways, and also don't understand the context of race, the way that it shows up in the US, and it's very different, in all of our countries, home countries, the way that race shows up can be different. And so being able to navigate what that looks like is unique as well.
And I think another myth, maybe the last one I want to kind of debunk, is another one that you brought up, which was around service provision for, let's say, domestic violence. I think people in general have this impression that people come into a service and like it's all, the problem is solved, right? It's all pretty and it works well. We had somebody from the UK called Mina Kumari, and we're talking about the challenges also for Black workers in mainstream domestic violence services, right? Where, it's another big challenge. They have to deal with a lot. They tend to be many, but they're not in leadership. So there is a lot about, you were talking about how some of it was just, let me bring some food or some hair product, but not a real understanding of, of what's happening within the community.
And I think, one of the things that the pandemic did for many of us, Pamela, is it highlighted what we already knew about access to economic options, around having fresh food in your community, around exactly what you said about having the status within your workforce to be able to work from home, or being in the service industry, or even in the gender-based violence movement. And based on whether or not you were in leadership, you were still having to go in to provide shelter services, et cetera. And then we saw that in very many instances, it was Black women and other women of color who were in those positions, right? And so we lift this up a lot, because what we saw through that experience was the rest of everyone getting to understand, because of the pandemic, and because we were shut down for so long, and really looking at safety kind of showing up in a bigger screen than it had before, really sort of putting an exclamation point behind some of the things that we all, yourself included, have been saying for a long time, that our communities experience violence differently, and that our access to options is also different because of the ways that systems are set up. And you hear me talk about systems a lot, and so I don't want to shy away from the fact that I'm talking about systems, because that there are traditional systems that have been, and there's no other way to say it, they have been harmful. They are barriers in access for our communities. And so a lot of our work is also around systems changing those systems to be more nimble and responsive to our communities, but also identifying, lifting up, and really saying that the other systems and the ways that we seek support are just as valid.
And it's all around cultural attitudes. Let's talk a little bit about that and how those cultural attitudes actually play also a part in violence against Black women. And it's something that we see day to day, and that needs to be dealt with. But as part of the work that you do, how do you try to address that?
So we talked a lot about the adultification of Black girls, that Black girls are sexualized, Black women are sexualized, that our history in this country related to racism and oppression, and it's not only in the US that we've seen that Black women and girls have been sexualized as early as 8 and 10, starting to be seen as grown women. And so our realities with violence have been such that we aren't seen as victims. We've been seen as strong. And so even within our community, we are seen as not needing the kind of help that very oftentimes we do, right? And so the way that shows up is, externally, we see when law enforcement respond, they don't see us as victims, right? We're not treated in that way. When we talk about the ways that we parent, they are different. And so people seeing that the ways that we parent can be dangerous. When we talk about women and accessing services, that Black women often are not seen as worthy of being titled survivors, but rather can be just as dangerous. When we talk about girls, that the vulnerability of girls, especially Black girls, not being seen, and then how that also shows up within our community is that we are not often we don't see ourselves as victims and survivors. And so we're not apt to seek help when violence occurs. And, one of the other things that we talk about especially for Black women and girls, is that there's this history of violence being a birthright. That we are expected to experience violence at some point in our lives, whether it's at home or outside of our homes. And so part of our root purpose is to say that violence is not a birthright for Black women and girls. We do not have to expect that we will experience violence in our lifetime. And so how do we talk about safety? How do we ensure that we are safe? How do we talk about that within our community? How do we talk about that outside of our community? And how do we debunk this myth of the strong Black woman, that it's okay for us to be vulnerable. It's okay for us to seek help. It's okay for us to be in those moments and rely on other people. But again, we lift up that the idea of having culturally specific services and culturally specific responses is critical to that, because you lifted up and you talked about trust. There's got to be trust. There has to be an understanding, and you've got to understand that layered context to really be able to provide those services.
I invite anybody who's hearing us to kind of really explore the issues around sexual violence to Black girls in college. It is absolutely horrendous. And this is because of what you were talking, Karma, this kind of sexualized view of Black women, that it affects our community so much. I also see it, being from the Latinx community, it's almost like it's this myth almost that, we enjoy almost being sexually assaulted,
Right.
which is it's horrendous and affects a lot of our youth. So I'm glad that you brought up the almost that sense that we are born and expected that that will happen. And Karma, let's talk a little bit. I know it's a painful topic, but the kind of historical context of a lot of this. This is as I said, right? It's affecting, despite all the conversation that we're having, it keeps on affecting our young women. So I would like to kind of get your kind of background on where is this come from, really?
So what we know is that, from the time of women, of Black people being enslaved, there has been this history of seeing and using our bodies for labor and for sex. And so the context of this starts from this idea, Pamela, it's painful but important. It's painful, but very important for us to talk about. This is not a new phenomenon. It is a purposeful phenomenon. It from the time of enslavement, our bodies were used as property, and because of that, we were seen as the more children that we could have, the more valuable we were, that we didn't have the right to say no. And so our bodies were used in that context. It impacted not only the relationship with our counterparts, with other Black men, it impacted our own realities and the ways in which we see our bodies. And so that being one piece, it also showed up in policy, right? Our ability to have the right to say no, even whether or not we showed up as a whole person. When we see laws that showed us as 3/5 of a person, right? And so all of those things set the context for why you see Black women as the Jezebel, as the mammy, and all of those other kind of stereotypes for the ways that Black women showed up, many of which take us outside of our own womanhood, right? And mean that they make us more vulnerable in so many ways, from the ways that we see ourselves in popular culture to the ways that we see ourselves depicted in law and public policy. And so I really appreciate you bringing this up, because it is a historical context that was framed then, but shows up today and shows up now.
No, it's very important to address it, to talk about it, and to understand when people, because this all feeds into unconscious biases, and people to be able to reflect maybe when they think about that way, where maybe this way of thinking comes. And I think this brings me to my kind of other point. As a woman of color, Ujima, working with a Black woman in the Black community, we do have thousands and thousands and thousands of allies, who really, and people who from their heart understand the problem. They might not have the lived experience, and they kind of really, in a way, want to help the support and stop this form of oppression, racism, whatever we want to call, that influences directly the way that women are affected. How can they do that? How can they do this in a way that is effective, that serves the work that Ujima does?
So one of the things, Pamela, that we talk a lot about is what allyship really means, and that Black women are leaders in our own right, have been leaders in this field, and that women of color have been leaders in this field, and that is a critical component of allyship. That allyship means partnership in a lot of places, and it means stepping back and allowing us to exert our leadership, lifting us up in places, showing that to be an ally means you're able to take direction. And also, oftentimes I think people think that they will come to this place where they get the gold star in allyship, right? And not understanding that it's a journey, right? To be a true ally is to understand that you are going to go in on a journey, that there is a lot of learning that has to happen, and that learning doesn't come at the expense of people of color, right? It's not our job to teach you everything. So there's got to be some self-education that happens along this journey, because if not, then we're doing the dual work of being the teacher and the doer at the same time, and we're already overwhelmed. And so that then having to take on the role of teaching everyone gets to be problematic. So I'd say, when I think about allyship, it's really, how do you take leadership from women and girls of color? It's identifying ways in which you can learn and increasing your own capacity around these issues. It's being involved and coming to the table open and honestly. It's investing, right? And very often what I see is that sometimes we'll talk about these issues related to women and girls of color, and then a mainstream organization will say, okay, well, I'll build a program, and that's part of my being an ally, instead of figuring out how do I invest in a culturally specific organization to have the capacity to provide these services in their own community, right? And so allyship is also recognizing that there are times when the resource is not for you, the resource is for that community, and how do you ensure that the investment is made there? And that comes back to that issue of leadership.
I'm gonna start we have a question that actually fits straight into that. How do we get people to listen to us, people of color? How do we take this mainstream? I know that's the crux of your work, and maybe I'm asking, I'm asking here for the silver bullet. I think Sean, who's hearing us, I think, maybe asking for the silver recipe, but how do we really get people to hear us, understand us, and embrace this?
I think we have to keep lifting up our voices. I think that we have to keep working in partnership with each other. I think that, people will hear us when they recognize that we're not going anywhere, when they see that we're taking ourselves seriously, and when they know and understand that we bring our own resources to the table. This issue of capacity has kind of been, I've seen it be a double-edged sword in our community, where people say, oh, well, they have, and a lot of time funders will say, well, we need to invest in the capacity of these organizations because they can't manage their own organization. They don't have the leadership skills to manage their own organizations. And so that means ultimately that we don't have the voice to drive our own work. And so what we say is, no, we have the capacity, we haven't had the funding to do so. When I hear this question of how do we get people to take us seriously, it is one, that we create the systems, right? That we don't back away from raising our voices when things get hard, when things are tough, that we stay in the fight, that we stay in the game, and that we start to create our own organizations and we start to invest in those, that we bring our community to the table, lift our own community's needs up, and we create a mechanism, a way for our communities to talk about what our realities are, right? When we sit at policy tables, very often, the individuals setting policy don't look like us, don't look like either of us, right? But they're setting policy about our community. So we've got to be in those rooms and in those spaces so that we can make the space for others of us to come behind us. And I think that's really going to be one of, and has been one of the most critical mechanisms we've used to make sure that our voices are heard. We make sure we're in those rooms. We make sure that we're in those spaces. When people tell us no, we find another way to get in there. And then we identify who are those allies that truly understand what it means to be an ally and can be in those spaces and say, it's important for us to hear from other Black women on these issues. It's important for us to hear from other Latina women on these issues. It's important for us to hear from other Asian women in those issues, and don't try to carry the message themselves.
Sure, I think that is essential, right? Ensuring that you open the space and let and let other people do the talking, which is, I think, what fails so many times. I think there's probably many organizations joining, and which again, and we spoke about this a little bit, who might be kind of, looking at their diversity and, and trying to come up, with ideas. How can an organization, in your point of view, really embrace diversity that benefits the population that they are serving?
Mhm. They have to invest, Pamela. I mean, I think that when we think about budgets, I always say budgets are a statement of our values, right? And so if you really believe in diversity, you really believe in equity, then you make that investment and you ensure that the equity and diversity shows up at every level of your organization, that your board members represent the diverse experiences and a diversity of populations, that your leadership represents diversity and equity, that the people working on the ground in your organization represent diversity and equity, that your policies speak to diversity and equity. It's got to be, and that your budget speaks to it. It's got to be in all of those places in order for it to actually, one, work, but then for your commitment to be true. And what we see is that sometimes people stop short with, I'm going to develop a program, or I'm going to hire 2 or 3 people, versus I'm going to actually invest and shift the way that my organization shows up from top to bottom.
If you are right now a 22-year-old Black woman who is starting to work in a domestic violence service, what would you tell them? What advice would you give them?
Oh, boy. So you mean I'm not a 22-year-old?
Oh, you're like 23, exactly like me, So we have a year on them for sure.
No, if I were talking to a younger Black woman in this movement, and we've talked about this a lot, I really would say, live in your truth, bring your truth into this space. Don't be afraid to show up as your authentic self. Your voice is important. Your voice is valuable, and that there are places and spaces where you belong, and to also have a life outside of the work. I think we forget that part, and we think that our whole self should be defined by the work that we do, and so we don't actually invest in those other pieces that make us whole, right? We don't read, we don't spend time with our families, we don't do those other things. And so I think that's so important. If you're not healthy and well, then you can't do this work. You can't do this work well, because you're also taking care of other people. And so I think that, bringing all of yourself means that you're vulnerable in so many ways. I see so many advocates that are so vulnerable because they're bringing their whole self to the space. And so I don't discourage that, but I also say have other outlets. Make sure that you have family and friends and other things that you're doing aside from the day-to-day pieces of this work. But I think the most important thing, Pamela, is for them to know that they're valuable, is for us to know, because so many other things will tell us that we're not, right? So many things will tell us that our speech is not right, that our hair isn't right, that the way that we dress isn't right. And so really pouring into young women in the field to say that you, as you are enough. You are an expert in your reality, and really, really supporting their leadership is important.
And they deserve to be in that table. They'll grow to be that kind of belief that they have to grow on to be on that table if that's what they want to do, right? That the spaces are open for them. Many of us just get told from, or just believe intrinsically because of how we've been raised up, that we're never gonna, progress to the next level, that we'll never be like that person. And it's important. I say that to everybody, you deserve to believe in yourself because you're an amazing voice. So I think that's that are the values. And I love that you're talking about resting and having kind of a circle around. I had just the most interesting conversation with an advocate, a manager, and she was talking about feeling guilty of taking a sabbatical. And I was like, no, like, we have work for kind of our generation. Take your time, come back, energize, refresh into kind of this fight. So I think that's really important. Any final message for any Black woman who might be suffering domestic or sexual violence karma on what they can do?
Absolutely. So the first thing would be that, there are resources available, and to really pour into Black women who are experiencing violence that is not what they deserve. That birthright issue is so important for our community. So really saying that it's not what you deserve. There are hotlines. I know for in the US, the 1-800-799-SAFE, which is the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Ujima has a resource center. You can log on to our website at www.ujimacommunity.org. We have a list of local resources as well on our website, so that people can access culturally specific organizations in their communities. And so, when survivors are critical, they are just the center of this work, Pamela. And so what I would say to them doesn't just stop at here are the services, but it's that we see you, we hear you, and that the work that we do is for you, it's about you, and you are central to all of this.
Karma, thank you so much for being an inspiration. I know we hadn't met until recently, but it was amazing, and I'm so glad that we've had this experience. I'm sure that we'll be working more together as we move forward. I love to find and keep on finding people that make my work better, and make that I know that I have more sisters around me that are pushing hard. So thank you so much also for being part of No More Week. We really appreciate it, and best for you and for your team.
And Pamela, thank you for making the space. Thank you for this incredible week. Congratulations again to you and your team. Thank you for being such an incredible inspiration. It's not often that we have people who make space for us the way that you did after one meeting. And so I really appreciate you and your leadership as well.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Take care.